The moment she leaned in, I smelled her perfume first. Something soft, like warm vanilla and faint cedar, and I remember thinking it was a strange thing to notice about a woman I had spoken to exactly twice in my life. Her name was Nora Ellis. She was the maid of honor. I was the best man's college roommate who had been seated at the wrong table for 45 minutes and hadn't corrected anyone because the shrimp cocktail was genuinely excellent. She leaned close enough that her shoulder touched mine, and she said very quietly, her lips barely moving, "I need you to pretend we're together for the rest of tonight. My ex won't stop staring, and I'm running out of ways to look unbothered." I set down my glass. I looked at her. Her jaw was set, her eyes were steady, but there was something underneath all of that composure that looked exhausted and just slightly desperate in the way only someone who has been performing calm for 3 hours can look. I said, "Define together." And she said, without missing a beat, "Enough that Derek thinks he made a mistake." I didn't know who Derek was yet. I didn't know anything about Nora Ellis except that she had a flower in her hair that was already coming loose, and that she had the particular posture of someone who had decided a long time ago that they would rather die than look weak in a crowd. I picked up my glass again. "Okay," I said. "That was all. Just okay. And I want to tell you right now, sitting here looking back at that night, that what happened next was not something either of us planned. But I also want to tell you that the best things that have ever happened to me were never something I planned either." Let me take you back to how I ended up at this wedding in the first place. Because context matters here, and also because I want you to understand exactly the state I was in when Nora Ellis sat down next to me and changed everything. My name is Caleb Reed. I'm 31 years old. I work as a structural engineer at a mid-sized firm in Portland, Oregon, which means I spend most of my professional life making sure buildings don't fall down, and most of my personal life in an apartment that could use serious help in the interior design department. I had been single for 2 years at that point. Not the kind of single where you're out every weekend and telling everyone you love your freedom. The other kind. The kind where you cook dinner for one every night and check your phone a little too often for a notification that doesn't come. My last relationship ended on a Tuesday in a coffee shop, and I wasn't bitter about it. Not anymore, but I had gotten very good at being alone, and somewhere along the way I had started to confuse being good at something with actually wanting it. Marcus Webb was my college roommate. We lived together for 3 years in an apartment above a laundromat that smelled permanently of dryer sheets and ambition. When he got engaged to Sophie Chen, I wasn't surprised. Sophie was the only person I had ever seen argue Marcus into being wrong about something and then make him feel good about it. They were the real thing. So when Marcus called me 8 months before the wedding and said, "You're coming, book the flight," I booked the flight. The wedding was in Savannah, Georgia, late April. The kind of weather that feels like the whole world is exhaling after a long winter. Warm and slow and smelling like jasmine from somewhere you can't quite find. I arrived the morning of the wedding and promptly got myself seated at the wrong table. Table 7 was supposed to be reserved for Marcus's college friends. I ended up at table 4, Sophie's cousins and what appeared to be her mother's book club. Nobody corrected me. The cousins were friendly, the book club women asked about my work, then spent 20 minutes discussing a novel I'd never heard of. I ate the shrimp cocktail, I watched the room fill with people who knew each other and felt the particular loneliness of being at a celebration surrounded by strangers. And then the ceremony happened, and it was one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen in my life. I want to be clear about Marcus and Sophie's ceremony because I don't want to rush past it. When Sophie came down the aisle in a dress her grandmother had partially sewn, and Marcus stood at the altar and started crying before she even reached him, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. There's something about watching two people choose each other in front of everyone they love that makes the world feel briefly, genuinely hopeful. The kind that just lands on you while you're standing in the third row. I was turning that feeling over in my mind like a smooth stone when I returned to table 4 for the reception and found Nora Ellis already sitting there. She wasn't supposed to be at table 4 either. What happened was that her original seat at table 11 put her directly in Derek's sightline for the entire dinner, and Sophie had quietly asked the venue coordinator to move her. The coordinator panicked and put Nora at the only table with an open chair, table 4, next to me. All I knew when she sat down was that the maid of honor who had given a speech 20 minutes earlier that made Sophie cry and made me press my fist briefly against my mouth to hold myself together was now sitting beside me with the expression of a woman completing a mission. We introduced ourselves. She already knew I was Marcus's friend. I told her the speech was incredible. She thanked me in a way that suggested she'd heard it 10 times and was running low on gracious responses. We talked for a few minutes about Marcus, about how Sophie was doing, about whether the band would play anything from after 2005. She was sharp and dry and funny in the quiet way, the kind of humor that sneaks up on you before you realize you're laughing. And then she went still beside me, not stiff, not panicked, just still. The way a person goes still when they see something they were hoping not to see. I followed her gaze without meaning to. Across the room, maybe 30 feet away, a man was looking at her. Mid-30s. Well-dressed in the way that communicates effort, he had the particular look on his face of a man trying to appear unbothered while being extremely bothered. Next to him, a woman with her hand on his arm who was beautiful in a very composed, intentional way. He looked from Nora to the woman beside him and back again, and I caught the exact flicker of something complicated moving across his face. Satisfaction, maybe. Or maybe the need to be seen having moved on. I'm not sure there's a clean name for what that expression is. I just know I didn't like it. That was when Nora leaned in and said what she said. And I said, okay, here is what being a fake boyfriend at a wedding actually looks like, in case you've never done it. It looks like leaning in when she says something so the angle of your shoulder blocks her from his sightline. It looks like picking up her champagne glass and handing it to her before she has to reach for it, because small attentiveness reads across a crowded room. It looks like laughing at things she says, which in Nora's case was extremely easy because she was actually funny, the kind of funny that you can't perform. The book club women noticed within 4 minutes. One of them, a woman named Harriet, who wore yellow and had the energy of someone who had seen everything, looked at me and said, "How long have you two been together?" Nora said, without hesitation, "Not long enough to stop surprising each other." Harriet looked delighted. I looked at Nora. She was already reaching for her bread roll, completely composed, and I remember thinking that this woman is a very particular kind of dangerous. The dinner moved slowly the way wedding dinners do, one toast building on another, the band warming up in the background. Derek stayed on his side of the room. But I noticed him glancing over. I noticed because Nora noticed, and I had begun, without consciously deciding to, paying attention to what Nora noticed. Every time his gaze drifted toward our table, something in her jaw tightened by 1 millimeter. She covered it perfectly. She laughed and talked and asked Harriet about the book they'd been discussing. But I could see it. The effort. The energy it takes to perform okay when you are not entirely okay. About 40 minutes in, I leaned close enough to speak quietly. "How long were you two together?" She didn't look at me right away. She picked up her water glass, took a small sip, set it down. 3 years, she said. 8 months ago. I nodded. She looked at me then. "You can ask the obvious question." I wasn't going to, I said. Something shifted very slightly in her expression. "He wanted different things," she said. "He wanted someone who would fit into his life the way it already was." I kept growing in directions that inconvenienced him. She said it evenly, with the particular flatness of someone who has processed a thing enough times that the sharpest edges are worn down. But flat doesn't mean gone. I know that particular voice. "And he's here tonight," I said, not a question. "He was Marcus's college friend, too," she said. "Sophie almost didn't invite him. I told her to. I didn't want to be the reason someone wasn't at her wedding." She paused. "I thought I'd be fine." Another pause, smaller. "I am fine." I looked at her. "Of course you are," I said. And I meant it, because everything about her told me she was exactly the kind of person who found a way to be fine, and that the cost of that was something only she knew. The band shifted into something louder. People started drifting toward the dance floor. I watched Sophie drag Marcus out there with the energy of someone who has been waiting for this specific song for months. He resisted for exactly 3 seconds, which is the right amount. and then he was out there spinning her and she was laughing with her whole face the way she does. I watched them for a moment. Nora watched them too. They make it look effortless, she said softly. It isn't though, I said. Marcus told me once that the first year they were together he almost broke up with her 3 times because he was terrified of how much he cared. Nora turned to look at me. Did he tell you that? He did. He said caring that much felt like standing at the edge of something very high. She was quiet for a moment. What made him stay? He said he realized the thing that scared him was the exact thing he was looking for. Nora looked back at the dance floor. Marcus and Sophie were doing something that could generously be called dancing. It was more like organized joy. That's either very brave or very stupid, she said. Probably both, I said. She laughed. Small and real. And I felt it in my sternum. Then Derek appeared. He walked over in the way that men who want to seem casual never quite manage to be. He had a glass in his hand and the slightly too relaxed posture of someone who has rehearsed this moment. He looked at Nora first, then at me, then back at Nora. Hey, he said. Just hey, like they were co-workers who hadn't seen each other in a month. Nora looked up at him with an expression so perfectly calibrated between warm and neutral that I genuinely admired the skill required. Derek, she said. Hi. He glanced at me again. Waiting, I realized. She picked up the signal without missing a beat. This is Caleb, she said. Caleb, this is Derek. I stood up, which I did not plan to do but which felt right. I extended my hand. Good to meet you, I said, with the exact level of friendliness that communicates I know who you are and I am not remotely threatened. His grip was firm in the testing way. Mine was firmer in the I noticed way. He said to Nora, You look great. She said, Thank you. He said, Having a good time. She said, A wonderful time. He looked at me again. Something was working in his expression that he was trying not to show. He said, How do you two know each other? And without missing a beat, without so much as a glance at me, Nora said, Caleb restored the structural plans on a building I was designing the interior for. He kept telling me my walls were load-bearing. I kept telling him they weren't. She looked at me with this small private smile. Turns out he was right. Derek looked between us. He laughed once, short. Right, he said. Well, great. He looked at Nora one more time, 1 second too long. Then he walked back across the room to the woman with the composed face. I sat back down. Nora exhaled very quietly through her nose. It was the only crack in the composure, and it lasted less than a second. The load-bearing walls thing, I said. Good. She looked at me. You are a structural engineer. I know, I said. That's why it was good. She laughed again. Longer this time. Something loosened between us after Derek walked away. It's hard to explain exactly. We had already been pretending together for over an hour. But that exchange with him had required something real. Some actual coordination, some genuine reading of each other, and having done it successfully, we both relaxed into a different kind of ease. We talked the way people talk when they're no longer trying to impress each other, and haven't yet started trying to protect themselves. She told me she worked in interior design, had her own small firm, had started it 3 years ago on a savings account that had made her mother nervous. I told her about the building that had taken up the last 8 months of my work life, a community center in Northeast Portland, the kind of project that reminded me why I got into engineering in the first place. She asked me why I got into it in the first place. Nobody had asked me that in a while. I told her the truth, because I liked the idea that something I put my hands and mind into would still be standing long after I was gone. She was quiet for a moment after that. Then she said, That's what I like about interiors, the opposite side of the same thing. I make the spaces people actually live in, the part that feels like home. I looked at her. Then we build the same thing, I said, from different directions. She looked at me for a moment that felt slightly longer than either of us intended. Yeah, she said quietly, I guess we do. The band had been playing for an hour when Sophie came over and wrapped her arms around Nora from behind and said something in her ear that made Nora smile in a way I hadn't seen yet. Softer. Less defended. Sophie looked at me with the particular expression of a bride who has noticed something and chosen not to comment directly, which is more powerful than commenting directly. She squeezed my shoulder as she left. Harriet from the book club raised her champagne glass at me. I decided not to think about any of that. The band called the wedding party to the dance floor for a group song. Nora stood up and smoothed her dress, which was a deep green that looked like river water in low light. She started to move toward the floor, then paused and looked back at me. "You don't have to stay at this table while I'm out there," she said. "I'll be fine. Derek's talking to someone." I looked over. Derek was indeed talking to someone. He was also positioned at an angle where he could still see the dance floor easily. I stood up. "I like dancing," I said. This was not entirely true. I like dancing about as much as I like filing quarterly reports, which is to say I am capable of it but would not describe it as a passion. Something in her expression told me she knew I was lying. She didn't call me on it. We walked out to the dance floor together. Here is something I did not expect. Nora Ellis danced like she wasn't being watched. Not like she was showing off, but like the music was something she was simply responding to honestly. There's a difference, and it's rare, and I stood there for a moment just watching before I remembered I was supposed to be participating. We danced in the loose group way of wedding dance floors, and at some point during the third song, Nora turned toward me and I turned toward her, and we were closer than the surrounding crowd required. The song was slower. I put my hand on her waist because it seemed like the natural thing to do, and she put her hand on my shoulder and we moved together in the easy way of two people who have somehow already figured out each other's rhythm. The flower that had been coming loose in her hair since dinner finally gave up entirely and she reached up to pull it out, not sure what to do with it, and I held out my hand and she dropped it into my palm and I put it in my jacket pocket. She watched me do it. Something in her face I couldn't quite read. "This is strange," she said quietly, close enough that I could hear her over the music. "Yeah," I said. "I don't usually ask strangers to pretend to be my boyfriend. I figured, I don't know if I've said thank you." "You haven't," I said. "But you don't have to." She looked at me. We were still moving slowly, her hand on my shoulder, mine on her waist. "Why are you being so good at this?" she asked. Her voice was genuinely curious, not flirtatious, not testing. Actually curious. I thought about it for a second. "I think because you needed someone to be," I said. And I was there. She looked at me for another moment. Then she looked away. But she didn't step back. Here is the part I wasn't prepared for. We stepped off the dance floor after the song ended and walked out through the side doors of the reception hall because Nora said she needed air and I said I'd come with her. The outdoor space was a stone terrace overlooking a garden that was dark except for the warm glow of string lights. It smelled like night-blooming jasmine and the faint sweetness of the river somewhere below. We stood at the railing and Nora slipped off one of her heels because her feet hurt and held it in her hand, which made her 4 inches shorter and somehow less formal, and I felt the whole evening shift register. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yeah." "Were you pretending?" I looked at her. "What do you mean, tonight?" The attentiveness, the dancing, the hand on my waist. She was looking out at the garden. "I know we agreed to the premise. I'm just trying to figure out how much of it was performance." I was quiet for a moment. The honest answer was forming itself slowly, and I wanted to say it right. "It started as performance," I said. "Then it stopped being." She turned to look at me. The garden lights caught the left side of her face and left the right side in shadow, and she looked like something I wanted to understand better. "When did it stop?" she asked. "Somewhere around the load-bearing walls," I said. She laughed, startled, and the laugh was the real one, the full one. And it undid something in me entirely. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, I don't want to be someone you fell for tonight because you were being kind to her. I know, I mean it. The worst thing you could do right now is mistake pity for something else." "I don't pity you," I said. "Pity is what I feel for someone who can't handle their situation. You handled yours. Perfectly. While being genuinely funny and making the book club woman named Harriet feel included, which I think deserves its own award." She looked away, hiding a smile. "What I feel for you is something different," I said. "I don't have a cleaner word for it than interested. I'm interested in you. I was interested before Derek showed up. I was interested when you said the thing about interiors and load-bearing walls, and I would like to find out if that interest is worth something." She was quiet. The string lights moved slightly in the warm breeze. Somewhere inside the reception hall, the band started something slow and old that I recognized but couldn't name. "I'm not in a good place for this," she said finally. Her voice was careful, not cold, careful. I thought I was. I thought 8 months was enough, and then I walked into this room and saw him standing there, and I realized I was angrier than I knew. "I'm not over being angry." "Okay," I said. "That's not a foundation. I know. So I don't want you to—" "Nora?" I waited until she looked at me. "I'm not asking you to be over it. I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm asking you for your number." She blinked. "That's it," I said. "I live in Portland. You apparently work there. I would like the chance to get a cup of coffee with you somewhere that isn't a wedding." She looked at me for a long time. The kind of long time that I have learned to let sit instead of filling. That was when the door behind us opened and Derek stepped out. He came out with the energy of a man who had been making a decision for 20 minutes and had finally made it. He saw us standing close at the railing. He saw Nora's one shoe off, the ease of two people who had forgotten to perform. He stopped. Then he kept walking. "Nora," he said, "can we talk, just for a second?" She turned to face him. The composed expression returned immediately, like armor clicking into place. "Derek, it's not a good time. It'll take 1 minute." He glanced at me. "Do you mind?" I started to step back. Nora said, "He stays. Just that. He stays." Derek looked at her, then at me, then back at her. He said, "I just wanted to say that you look happy, and I'm glad." He said, "I think I made the wrong choice." She let that sit. She said very quietly, "Derek, you didn't leave me because you made the wrong choice. You left me because you made the right one for who you are. And I spent 6 months figuring that out." His face did something complicated. "You deserve someone who doesn't need you to stay small to fit their life," she said. "I hope Natalie is that for you. But that's not what I need tonight." She looked at him steadily. "I'm enjoying my evening." He nodded once. "Yeah," he said, "okay." He went back inside. The door swung shut, and the music from the band went muffled and distant. Nora stood at the railing for a few seconds with her back to me. I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the right thing, and I have learned, slowly, to let it be the right thing. Then she turned around. The composed expression was gone. Not broken, just down, like she had finally given herself permission to take it off. She looked like what she actually was, a woman who had carried something heavy all evening and had just set it down. "Thank you," she said. "For what specifically?" "For not needing it to be romantic when it wasn't. And for staying anyway." I held her gaze. "Those aren't different things," I said. Something moved across her face. She looked down at the shoe in her hand, then back up at me. "Portland," she said. "You want coffee." "I want coffee," I said. "I also want to hear more about the building you were designing the interior for when the structural engineer kept telling you your walls were load-bearing." She laughed. "The client ended up going with someone else." "That's a crime," I said. "The ceiling is probably fine. Structurally speaking, I have serious doubts." She shook her head, but she was still smiling. She put her shoe back on, which brought her back to her full height, and then she opened her small bag and found her phone. She held it out to me. I typed my number in. She called it once so I'd have hers and hung up before it connected. A small professional thing to do. I liked that about her. Sophie caught Nora's eye from across the room and gave her the particular look of a best friend, asking if everything is okay. Nora gave her the small nod that said yes. Marcus found me at the edge of the dance floor and put his arm around my shoulders and said, "I heard from Harriet at table 4 that you were holding it down." I told him Harriet was a formidable source of information. He laughed and went back to Sophie, who was already turning toward him the way she always does, like he's the direction of home. I danced with Nora one more time before the night ended. Not because Derek was watching, which he wasn't. Not because we were still performing, which we weren't. but because the band played something slow and old, and she looked at me and tilted her head toward the floor, and I followed her, because it seemed like exactly the right thing to do. We didn't talk much during that last song. We moved together in that easy rhythm we had somehow already found. The string lights warm above us, the jasmine still drifting through the open terrace doors, and a small white flower in my jacket pocket that I had absolutely no intention of throwing away. The reception wound down the way good parties do, slowly and reluctantly. People gathered coats and found each other for goodbye hugs. Nora was pulled into a long embrace by Sophie that involved some crying and some laughing, and then some crying again. I shook Marcus's hand and he pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than usual, which told me he was happy in the deep, bone-level way. Outside, the night air had cooled and smelled like cut grass and river water. Nora found me near the stone steps. She had her small bag over her shoulder, and the green dress had collected a tiny grass stain along the hem that she either hadn't noticed or had decided not to care about. I privately decided it suited her. "Safe travels," she said. "Safe travels," I said. She looked at me. "You were good at this tonight." "I had a good partner," I said. She nodded once, slowly. "I'll probably think about this for a while," she said. Not flirtatious, just honest. The part where it stopped being a performance, she added, quieter. "Me too," I said. Her car arrived before mine. She got in, and as the door closed, she looked at me through the window for a moment. Just a moment. Then the car pulled away down the long drive between the rows of old trees, taillights going red through the Spanish moss. I stood there for a while after she was gone. I want to tell you that I played it cool after that I waited the appropriate amount of time and didn't think about her too much. I want to tell you that, but it would not be accurate. What actually happened was that I flew back to Portland on Sunday and spent the first half of Monday letting a 20-minute task stretch into 3 hours because I kept waiting for a notification that didn't come. And then, at 11:43 in the morning, my phone lit up. Not a text, a photo. Blueprints, with a sticky note in the corner that read, "Load-bearing wall. I need a second opinion." I called her back in 30 seconds, which is probably too fast and which I have no regrets about. The first phone call lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know because my phone logs it that way. We talked about the project, which turned out to actually have a load-bearing wall question, and then we talked about everything else. The way conversations go when two people are slightly surprised by how easy it is. She told me about growing up in a house where her mother rearranged the furniture every 6 months because she said changing the space changed her thinking. I told her about my dad, who was a carpenter, who said the same thing about every structure he ever built. It's only as strong as what holds it up from underneath. She went quiet after that for a second, then said, "That's what I'm trying to do with interior design. Get to the underneath part." I said, "Then we really are building the same thing from different directions." And she said quietly, "Yeah, you did." The coffee happened 2 weeks later. A small place in northeast Portland with good light and chairs that were slightly too low, which meant we both leaned forward slightly across the small table, which meant we were closer than the space technically required. We talked for 3.5 hours. The barista cleaned around us twice. Nora drew something on a napkin to explain a design concept, and I turned it and showed her a structural issue, and she looked at my correction for a long moment and said, "That's actually better." I told her it was a structural engineer's highest honor. She threw the balled-up napkin at me. I caught it. We both knew something had already been decided, we just weren't saying it out loud yet, which felt right. Some things should have time to breathe before you name them. I'm not going to rush through what came next, because what came next was the part that mattered most. Nora had told me she wasn't in a good place, and she hadn't been wrong. Over the following weeks she had days where she was lighter and days where something from the history with Derek surfaced, and she needed to be quiet with it. She never hid that from me. That was what I came to understand about her, the specific courage it takes to let someone see you still working through something instead of presenting them with the finished version of yourself. She told me once that she had spent most of the time with Derek trying to be a smaller, quieter version of herself because he found her too much. She said it matter-of-factly, like reporting a weather event. Then she looked up at me and said, "I'm not going to do that again, with anyone." "Is that a problem?" she asked. "No," I said. "It's the opposite of a problem." Something settled in her face. "Okay," she said, "just okay." The same word I had said to her across a crowded wedding table weeks earlier. We both heard the echo of it. There's a thing that happens when you stop pretending and just let something be what it is. It doesn't look like the movie version. It arrives quietly, in Tuesday mornings and long phone calls and the specific comfort of being in the same space as someone and not needing to fill every silence. It arrives the first time you realize you've been telling her things you don't tell other people. Not because you decided to, but because somehow she became the person you say things to. It arrives when she leaves her jacket on the back of your chair and you don't move it for 3 days because the apartment feels better with it there. The night I knew for certain, we were on her terrace with takeout containers between us and the city lights below, and she was telling me about a client who had rejected her entire design plan at the final presentation. She was frustrated, genuinely, but she was also processing it out loud the way she does, turning it over, looking for the useful thing inside it. And at some point she stopped talking and looked at me and said, "You're not saying anything." I said, "You didn't need me to yet." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "The night of the wedding, when you said it stopped being a performance." "Yeah," I said. "I think that was the moment I was already in trouble," she said. "I just didn't know how to tell you without it sounding like exactly the wrong reason." "It's not the wrong reason," I said. "You needed someone to show up for you and I showed up. That's how it starts sometimes." She looked down at the takeout container in her hands. "Caleb." "Yeah. I don't want to pretend anymore." "Then don't," I said. "We're not." She looked up at me. The city was orange and gold below us, and the jasmine was gone, replaced now by the smell of late summer in the city, warm pavement, and something green. She leaned forward across the small space between us and kissed me. Soft, certain, the kind of kiss that isn't tentative because it has been decided already, somewhere, quietly, over weeks of phone calls and coffee and shared blueprints and balled-up napkins. I kissed her back. I held her face in my hands, gently, like something I intended to be careful with. When we pulled apart, she rested her forehead against mine. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "you're better at this than Derek ever was." "Good," I said, "because I wasn't pretending." She laughed. "The real one. The full one. The one that undoes me every single time. I have thought many times about the series of small accidents that put us both at that wedding. Marcus getting us seats at different tables, the coordinator panicking and putting Nora at table 4, the shrimp cocktail being good enough that I didn't bother correcting anyone. All the tiny arbitrary things that mean two people end up sitting next to each other at precisely the right moment. I'm an engineer. I believe in load calculations and the specific certainties of physics. But I believe that something in that room put a woman with a flower coming loose from her hair next to a man who was very good at being alone and very tired of it, and that whatever it was knew exactly what it was doing. Nora keeps the photo of us from the wedding on the shelf in her studio. Marcus sent it to her a week after. In the photo we're at the edge of the dance floor and we're laughing at something and neither of us is looking at the camera. We're looking at each other. She showed it to me the first time I saw it, and said we were already gone, weren't we? I looked at it for a long time. "Yeah," I said, "we really were." She put it back on the shelf. The small white flower from her hair is in a glass jar on the same shelf, dried now, which she pretends not to have noticed me noticing. I have not told her I know she put it there on purpose. Some things are better left as a small, private truth between two people who have stopped pretending and started choosing, every single day, to be exactly where they are. Some love stories start with dramatic declarations and perfect timing. This one started with a woman who needed someone to pretend, and a man who turned out to be very bad at pretending badly. It started with a wedding in Savannah in late April, with string lights and jasmine and a band that played something slow and old. It started with a simple question and a simpler answer. It started with okay. It started, I think, the moment she leaned close, and the first thing I noticed was that she smelled like warm vanilla and faint cedar, and something in me said, "Pay attention. This matters. Pay attention." and for once in a very long time I listened.